I am here to suffer death justly, for I have offended God and the king.
On a freezing morning in mid-January, as the sun barely climbed above the stone turrets of the Tower of London, a man walked his last path toward the scaffold on Tower Hill. His name was Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and he was no common criminal. No anonymous soul dragged into history's shadows. He was the final nobleman to be executed under the direct command of King Henry VIII, the last head to fall before the king's own body collapsed into death and decay. This is not just the story of a man who crossed the crown. It is the story of ambition gone too far, of royal paranoia in its final hours, and of a tomb that refused to forget. Henry Howard's story begins in blood. He was born into the most powerful noble family in England, the Howards, a dynasty thick with ambition, pride, and danger. He was the eldest son of Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, and through his veins ran the same royal blood as Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, two queens who met their deaths by the axe. This was a man born into privilege, educated beyond most of his peers, and raised alongside the illegitimate son of the king himself, Henry Fitzroy. They played together, learned together, perhaps even dreamed together. But the dreams of noble children are dangerous things when grown into men with enemies at court. Henry Howard was no ordinary courtier. He was brilliant, yes, but also impulsive, reckless, and entirely too proud of his lineage. He once smashed windows in the streets of London just to make a point. He brawled with rivals. He viewed himself not just as a nobleman, but as someone born to rule, or at the very least, to stand above others. He believed that the new men of the Tudor court, commoners who had risen under Cromwell and the Seymours, were polluting the bloodlines of power, and he hated them for it. In his mind, nobility was not earned. It was inherited, and Henry Howard had inherited enough pride for a dozen men. His downfall was slow and tragic. As Henry VIII aged, and his body deteriorated into a mass of ulcers and pain, his mind grew darker, more paranoid, more desperate to protect the crown for his sickly son Edward. And in the final weeks of his life, the king began to suspect that the Howards, with their pride, their power, their blood, were planning to seize control once he died. It wasn't entirely fantasy. Howard had indeed ordered his widowed sister to seduce the king in a last-ditch bid for influence. She refused, horrified, and turned on her brother, testifying against him in the most dangerous court in England, the king's inner circle. But even betrayal by blood wasn't the most fatal mistake Howard made. No. That came when he arrogantly displayed the royal arms of Edward the Confessor, a long-dead medieval king, on his own shield. It was a symbolic gesture, one that hinted at royal descent, even at claim. In a world where symbols could kill, this was suicide. The king saw it not as arrogance but as treason. It was enough. Henry Howard was arrested, locked in the Tower, and sentenced to death on the 13th of January. In the year 1547, 6 days later, before a crowd thick with frost and fear, Henry Howard climbed the scaffold on Tower Hill. He spoke briefly, his voice calm. Then he knelt, placed his neck upon the block, and the executioner swung the axe, just like that. The final act of Henry VIII's long reign was written in blood. The head fell. The king, who would die himself within weeks, had taken one last victim with him into the grave. But the story did not end there. Unlike many condemned men, Howard was not tossed into a pit or left to rot. Perhaps because of his rank, perhaps because his family still held sway behind the scenes. He was buried with surprising care. His body, possibly reunited with his severed head, was placed in a coffin and interred in the Church of All Hallows near the Tower. And there it rested, for nearly 70 years. Until, in the year 1614, his son ordered the coffin exhumed. The journey of Henry Howard's remains across England, from a quiet grave near the place of his death to the towering church of Framlingham in Suffolk, was no ordinary procession. It was a reclamation, a rewriting of legacy, a family's way of saying that this man, traitor or not, if deserved to lie beside his kin with honor. The tomb built for him was vast, ornate, ave defiant, a painted alabaster monument, decked with heraldic beasts and family arms, sat atop a vault. At his feet, in sculpted form, kneeled his sons. By his side, his wife Frances, and above it all, not a cross, but symbols of blood, pride, and ancestry. It was not a religious tomb. It was a statement. For centuries, the tomb stood silent, until time cracked it open. In the 19th century, workers restoring the church broke into burial vaults. Rumors swirled of seeing bodies, of relics disturbed, of secrets uncovered. In the 1970s, a full restoration revealed holes where a coronet, a small crown, had once sat by Howard's knees. It had been stolen. A replica now rests in its place. But no one opened the vault. No one checked if the body of Henry Howard still lay below. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe only his name lies there, carved in stone, while his bones sleep in another grave, forgotten by time. What we know is this: Henry Howard was the last nobleman to be executed by Henry VIII. And while the king himself was buried in rot and silence, the traitor he condemned is remembered in stone, in paint, in legend. This was not just a man who lost his head. This was a man who refused to be buried quietly. His story, and his coffin, would not stay shut. There are many ways to die under a Tudor king: by blade, by fire, by rumor, but there is perhaps no swifter death than the one brought on by pride. And Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, wore pride like a second skin. It clung to every step he took through court, every glance he cast at common-born men dressed in velvet they hadn't inherited, and every word that crossed his lips in disdain for those who had risen through favor instead of blood. He was the kind of man who believed the world belonged to men like him, men whose ancestors had ridden beside kings and whose names were etched into the roots of England itself. And yet it wasn't a sword, or a lover, or even a failed rebellion that brought him down in the end. It was a shield, a coat of arms, a symbol so ancient and so charged that it cracked open the thin wall between royal suspicion and royal execution. It was the crown he dared to display, not on his head, but in heraldry, and it cost him everything. To understand the full weight of what Henry Howard did, we must step back from the scaffold and return to the boiling pot of paranoia that was the court of Henry VIII in the last days of his reign. The year was 1546. The king was no longer the virile golden prince of his youth. He was grotesquely bloated, riddled with ulcers, unable to walk, and held together by poultices, whispers, and iron will. His sixth queen, Catherine Parr, tended him as both nurse and hostage, and around his throne swirled factions, Protestant and Catholic, noble and new-blooded, each hungry for control of the realm once the inevitable happened, and the king succumbed to his festering decay. The heir, Prince Edward, was still a boy, and in the shadows, every nobleman with royal blood, or even the suggestion of it, was eyed as a potential threat. Henry Howard, with his flamboyant confidence and ancient lineage, was exactly the kind of man who should have kept his head down. But instead, he leaned into danger. He had long held contempt for those who surrounded the king, the Seymours, who rose to power through Jane, the mother of the prince, the reformers and new men who dared to shape religion without consulting the old blood. Even Thomas Cromwell, long dead by this point, had earned his undying hatred for daring to touch the reins of government with common hands. To Howard, they were usurpers of noble space, intruders in halls built by aristocracy. And as the king's health waned, and the court shifted like quicksand beneath velvet shoes, Howard became reckless. He ordered, or perhaps merely permitted, a heraldic alteration to be made to his family arms, a minor act on parchment, but a seismic insult in Tudor politics. He had emblazoned his shield with the arms of Edward the Confessor, one of England's last pre-conquest kings, whose bloodline, it was whispered, ran faint but unbroken through the veins of the Howard family. It was a bold claim, not just to nobility, but to ancient royalty, the crown of Edward the Confessor, though long gone, still shimmered with symbolic power. To bear it even as decoration was to say, without speaking, I belong to this land more than the king's own son. And the king heard it loud and clear. It may have been others who whispered it into the sovereign's ear, dripped poison onto the parchment like so many before. But once it reached Henry VIII's decaying body, it ignited something violent and familiar fear. The fear that he, the great architect of modern England, might die and leave a kingdom to be seized, not by his son, but by a man who had the audacity to claim equal right. And in this court, fear always led to chains. The accusation was not merely about heraldry. It was about intention. It was said that Howard had ambitions for the throne, that he conspired with his father to seize power during the vulnerable regency of Prince Edward, that he had urged his sister Mary, a widow, to seduce the dying king in a final effort to cement their family's hold on power. She refused violently, vocally, and then testified against him. Whether it was true or not mattered little. The tide had turned. He was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. His father, the Duke of Norfolk, was also imprisoned, but would be spared execution only by the king's death. Henry Howard, however, I had no such luck. He was too young, too volatile, too dangerous in the eyes of a king teetering on the edge of death. The charge of treason was formalized with the shield as its centerpiece, the arms of Edward the Confessor twisted into a noose around his neck. And while the world outside the tower went about its winter business, Howard sat in his cell. A man who had once dined with kings, fought in France, ruled armies, and walked the palaces as if born to them. Now, stripped of titles, of allies, and of illusion, he waited for the blade. He was sentenced on the 13th day of January, in the year 1547. 6 days later, they came for him. What's most chilling, perhaps, is that Henry Howard never truly tried to flee the accusation. He defended himself. Yes, but there was a sense, according to those few records that remain, that he had already resigned himself to fate. He was a Howard, a man of blood and pride. He would meet death as he had lived publicly, defiantly, and on his own terms. But there is another layer, one that haunts the story long after the axe fell. By the time Henry Howard was executed, the king himself was dying. Less than 2 weeks later, Henry VIII would succumb to the rot that consumed him. His will had not been signed. His body would burst open in its coffin. His soul, if such things are real, would drift into history, leaving behind a trail of wives, wars, and beheadings. But in those final weeks, in those desperate hours when the king's mind flickered between lucidity and madness, it was the name Howard that lingered. It was the vision of a young man bearing royal arms that haunted him. It was the idea that someone else might sit on the throne, not through merit, but through blood. And so he killed him. The crown Henry Howard dared to display was never worn. It never sat upon his head. But it cost him that head nonetheless. And in the centuries since, historians have debated whether it was ambition or arrogance, loyalty or lunacy, that drove him to such a dangerous act. What we know is that in Tudor England, symbolism could kill faster than swords, and one misplaced coat of arms could weigh more than 100 armies. Today, the tomb of Henry Howard stands as one of the most ornate and carefully restored monuments of the Tudor age. His effigy rests beside that of his wife, surrounded by sculpted children, heraldic beasts, and a replica coronet stolen long ago. But beneath that alabaster silence lies a man who once dared to claim a crown not by conquest, but by inheritance, and who paid the ultimate price for dreaming in symbols before the scaffold was raised, before the axe was sharpened, before Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, ever laid his neck on the block. There was a whisper, half command, half plea, spoken behind closed doors and sealed letters. It came not from a soldier or a spy master, but from a brother desperate, cornered, and far too proud to beg any man for mercy. So instead, he turned to his sister. Her name was Mary Howard, the Duchess of Richmond, and once she had walked the halls of court, draped in silk and shadow, the young widow of the king's bastard son. She had known favor, she had known power, she had also known how quickly a Tudor smile could twist into a death warrant. She was no innocent, no pawn, and that made what her brother asked of her all the more impossible. Henry Howard asked Mary to seduce the king. It wasn't a jest, nor a madman's mutter in the dark. It was a calculated request, born of politics and panic. The king, Henry VIII, was rotting slowly from the inside out, yet still clung to power with the fists of a dying god. He had one son, Edward Young, sickly, and surrounded by wolves. The court buzzed with factions sharpening their blades for the regency. The Howards, once dominant, were being pushed to the edge, and Henry Howard saw in his sister the last card he could play. She was still young, still striking, still a duchess. She had been married to the king's son, Fitzroy, and had shared his bed, his name, and the favor that came with it. She was one of the last women at court with a direct, personal tie to the Tudor bloodline. If she could win the king's affections, if she could, even briefly, replace Queen Catherine Parr in his sickbed heart, then the Howards might reclaim their place in the circle of power. It was a gamble. Yes, but it was the kind of gamble Henry Howard had built his life upon. He underestimated his sister. Mary Howard was not a woman bred for subservience. Though widowed young, she had refused to remarry. Despite offers and pressure, she had retained her status, her wealth, her independence, rare for any woman in Tudor England, rarer still for one so close to the throne. And when the request came from her brother, whether whispered directly or relayed through trusted hands, her response was as sharp as any axe the Tower had ever seen. She said she would rather slit her own throat. There are no letters that survive with those exact words. But the sentiment is recorded. Her horror. Her disgust. Her refusal. She would not crawl into the bed of a bloated, ulcer-ridden king to rescue a brother who had danced too close to the sun. She would not barter her body for courtly favor. She would not, as she saw it, disgrace herself for a man who had brought ruin upon their family through pride and foolish ambition. And worse, when pressed, she did more than refuse. She testified, in a court where loyalty was currency and silence was often the difference between life and death. Mary Howard spoke. She spoke of what her brother had asked. She confirmed the suspicions already growing like rot in the corners of the king's mind. She added her voice to the chorus that labeled Henry Howard not just proud or dangerous, but treasonous. And in doing so, she may have been the final weight on the scale that tipped toward execution. Was it betrayal? Was it self-preservation? Or was it justice? No one will ever truly know what Mary felt in those moments. Perhaps she feared the king's wrath more than her brother's love. Perhaps she saw, with brutal clarity, that the Howards were doomed, no matter what she did. Perhaps she had simply grown tired of playing games in a court that devoured women like her and turned them into pawns. Ghosts. Or worse. But what we do know is this: she lived. While her brother's head rolled on Tower Hill, she remained at court. Quiet. Untouched. Her reputation, somehow, survived the scandal. She would never remarry. She would never again sit beside a king. But she kept her name, her lands, her dignity, and in the pages of history, her silence speaks louder than any speech her brother gave on the scaffold. There is a strange poetry to this chapter of Tudor history. A brother asks his sister to offer herself to power. She refuses. And he dies. The court, ever hungry, moves on. The king follows his victim to the grave only days later. And Mary Howard, who held the power to shift the fate of an entire family with a single choice, slips into the background of time. She was never sainted, never executed, never crowned. She simply survived. But in that survival lies a question, haunting and unanswered. Was her refusal the last act of integrity in a world gone mad with ambition, or the final dagger in a brother already bleeding out from pride? Some say she saved herself. Others say she damned him. But both can be true. In the court of Henry VIII, virtue and betrayal often wore the same face. And Mary Howard, the sister who refused to seduce the king, carried both truths with her to the end of her days. It began before dawn, as all executions do, in that hushed hour when even London seems to hold its breath. The air on Tower Hill was brittle with frost, clinging to the cloaks and beards of the crowd that had gathered, drawn by the morbid rhythm of Tudor justice. They had come to see a traitor die. They had come to see a Howard fall. They had come, as they always did, to watch the axe rise and the silence that always followed it. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, walked to the scaffold, not like a man dragged to his death, but like one attending a final performance. His shoulders were straight, his pace steady. He had been sentenced on the 13th day of January, in the year 1547, and now, 6 days later, the order was being carried out. Tower Hill was no stranger to death. The ground was thick with the blood of men who had once worn armor and titles: bishops, queens, boots, and plotters had all passed through the same space. But there was something different in the air that morning, an unease that buzzed beneath the stillness. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this man, the one about to die, was not some forgotten name plucked from obscurity, but a son of England's proudest bloodline, Perhaps it was the knowledge that the king himself was barely clinging to life just beyond the river, festering behind locked doors at Whitehall. Perhaps it was that this death felt like the last note in a requiem that had begun decades earlier. He had no carriage, no blindfold, no priest shouting prayers into the cold, just the slow ascent up wooden steps, each one creaking beneath the weight of generations of nobility and shame. The crowd made way, not with jeers, but with a reverent quiet, like they knew something sacred, something terrible was about to take place. He reached the platform and looked out across the sea of faces, merchants, courtiers, spies, servants, children hoisted onto shoulders to witness something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Somewhere, perhaps, a friend watched. More likely, an enemy. And somewhere in the tower behind him, his father waited for a fate that would never arrive, not because of mercy, but because the king would die before he could sign the next execution warrant. The executioner stood ready, axe in hand, the block gleaming with frost. And then Henry Howard spoke. What he said, exactly, has not survived. The records are vague. The witnesses too distracted by spectacle or shame. But we know he addressed the crowd. We know he defended his honor. We know he refused to confess to a crime he did not believe he had committed. And we know he did not beg. Because Henry Howard, for all his faults, would never have bent the knee to a crowd, nor to the king who had condemned him. He knelt, placed his neck upon the block, and then, as all traitors did, waited. The executioner did not hesitate. The blade fell once, clean and final, splitting the stillness like thunder. His head rolled into a basket lined with straw. His body sagged forward, lifeless. Blood soaked the wood and dripped down onto the earth beneath. And then came the silence. Not the silence of respect, but the stunned, empty quiet that always follows violence done in daylight. It is the kind of silence that settles deep into the lungs of a city and refuses to leave. It is the sound of something old ending, something inevitable, something that should never have happened but did. Henry Howard's head was not displayed on London Bridge like so many before him. It is likely, though not certain, that his rank spared him that final indignity. Instead, his body, perhaps reunited with the severed head, was taken from Tower Hill and prepared for burial. Not a traitor's pit, not a mass grave, but a proper coffin. Wood, nails, cloth, the trappings of nobility. Even in disgrace, he was interred at the Church of All Hallows, just a stone's throw from the place where his blood had stained the scaffold. There, beneath stone and soil, the last nobleman executed by Henry VIII was laid to rest. Or so they believed, because even in death, Henry Howard would not be allowed to sleep undisturbed. Years later, his son would exhume him, move him, bury him again in a grander tomb, as if rewriting history with alabaster and heraldry could undo what had been done on that January morning. But that is another chapter. For now, on the scaffold, beneath a pale and unfeeling sky, the final scene of Henry Howard's life played out with brutal simplicity. No grand speeches from the crown, no last-minute pardons, just wood, steel, blood, and breathless silence. The king who ordered his death would follow him into the grave within days. But Henry Howard died first. He died proud. He died betrayed. He died unbowed. And the silence that followed him down the scaffold steps has never truly ended. He should have stayed there beneath the stone, beneath the prayers, beneath the weight of a death that had closed the chapter on his name: Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, traitor by decree, noble by blood, to buried just steps from the scaffold where his head had fallen, laid to rest in the Church of All Hallows near the Tower of London. It should have ended there. But nothing about his story was simple. Nothing about the Howards ever stayed buried for long. His burial, for all its suddenness, had been granted a strange kind of dignity. The law demanded his blood, but tradition, perhaps fear, perhaps reverence, gave him a coffin. His rank had spared him the pike, the bridge, the public rot. Instead, his body was prepared with care. Some say his head was sewn back on, that the family intervened quietly, bribed someone, or used the fading influence they still clutched to keep him whole in death. Even if the kingdom had broken him in life, no tomb marked the grave. No marble effigy bore his likeness. His name passed from mouth to memory. From the chatter of court to the long silence of the years, All Hallows watched over his bones, tucked him away like a secret. No one dared speak too loudly. The king who had condemned him was dead just days later, leaving behind a boy too young to rule and a court too full of ghosts to breathe easy. For 67 years, Howard remained in that ground, and then the grave was opened. It was the year 1614. England had changed hands, again and again, kings crowned and buried, towers emptied and filled anew, but the Howards remained, and Henry Howard's son, bearing his father's name like a legacy and a burden, had decided that the man who had died as a traitor should rise again, at least in memory. He petitioned for the body, requested that his father be exhumed from the earth of London and brought home to Suffolk, where the family's great church at Framlingham stood proud among the rolling fields and carved stone. The Church of St. Michael the Archangel had become the resting place for the Howard line, a place not of shame, but of splendor. And now, Henry Howard would join them. The coffin was lifted. We do not know what they saw when they opened the grave, if they opened it at all. Was the body intact? Was the head still attached? Had time faded the violence, softened the memory, returned dignity to the corpse? Those details are lost, or perhaps deliberately unrecorded. What matters is that the journey began. The cart that carried Henry Howard's coffin rolled slowly out of London, its wheels biting into frozen mud, its cargo heavier than bone. For days it moved across the countryside, through villages and fields, past cathedrals and crumbling abbeys, until it reached the stone shadow of Framlingham. There, beneath the echoing vaults of St. Michael's in person, a new grave waited. But this was no quiet interment. The Howards did not bury their dead in silence. They buried them in marble, in alabaster, in color and grandeur. The tomb built for Henry Howard in Framlingham was not a monument to loss. It was a monument to legacy reclaimed. On top of the vault rose a painted sculpture of the man himself, carved in stone, dressed in armor, eyes closed in eternal prayer. Beside him, Lady Frances de Very, his wife, placed later to sleep beside the husband history had almost erased. At his feet, their two sons kneel in perpetual devotion. At his head, three daughters wait in stillness. Lions and heraldic beasts snarl from the corners. The coat of arms blazes with pride. And somewhere, once gleaming, now faded, a small coronet rested, proof of status, proof of defiance. It is a strange thing to look at a traitor immortalized in beauty. The tomb makes no mention of Tower Hill, no echo of the axe, no hint of betrayal, of accusation. of that cold January morning. It speaks only of family, of nobility, of a man who served his country and his crown. It is not a tomb of shame. It is a tomb of redemption carved in stone. But tombs, like graves, cannot always hold the past. Century passed. The church endured storms, neglect, time's slow ruin. In the 19th century, repair began, and workmen moved among the crypts. They opened vaults. They disturbed the sleep of the dead. Some say they saw the body of Henry Fitzroy, the king's bastard son and Howard's childhood friend, still laid out in state beneath the church. But no one can say for certain whether Howard's vault was breached. Then, in the 1970s, the tomb itself began to sag. Restoration was needed. Cracks split the alabaster. The colors faded. When the team began repairs, they discovered something strange: holes in the stone where the coronet had once been placed. It was gone, stolen, displaced, lost to time, or taken by hands that respected neither the dead nor their story. A replica was made, placed exactly where the original had been. But they did not open the vault. They did not check if the body of Henry Howard still rested below. Even now, no one knows for certain. Perhaps he lies there, complete. Perhaps only bones, or only stone. Perhaps his head never made the journey. Perhaps he was never buried at All Hallows at all, but dumped in an unmarked pit within the tower, only for his name to be moved later, while his remains remained lost. The Tudors were never above lies, even in death, and the Howards knew how to bend history when memory grew too heavy to carry. What matters, perhaps, is not what's under the tomb, but what it says above it. It says that a man condemned by a dying king was reclaimed by his blood. It says that the silence of Tower Hill did not last forever. It says that some stories, some names, are too loud to stay buried. It should have stood forever. That was the intention. A monument not to a death, but to a name. A slab of painted alabaster, heavy with meaning, with memory, with defiance. The tomb of Henry Howard was more than stone and sculpture. It was a correction, a rewriting of the ending that had been written in blood and mud on Tower Hill. It said he is not forgotten. It said he was not a traitor. It said, look how noble we still are, even now. And for a time, it worked. The tomb stood tall within the vaulted walls of St. Michael the Archangel in Framlingham, surrounded by the dust of centuries and the soft breath of prayers. People walked past it, pointed to it, read the name, nodded in respect, and moved on. But stone, like memory, is not immune to time. It settles, it fractures, it remembers. By the 20th century, the tomb began to whisper of its age. The center started to sink. The flanks began to split. The colors once so vivid had faded into the pale hues of long exposure. The reds were dust. The blues chalked over. The faces carved into eternity were cracked around the eyes. Something beneath had shifted, perhaps the earth itself, or perhaps the vault below had given way, bowed under the weight of so many years and so many secrets. It was decided, in the quiet language of English preservation, that restoration was necessary, that the tomb of Henry Howard, once the most dangerous man in England, required help to stand again. Experts arrived, tools in hand, reverent in their work, careful not to disturb what they did not understand. But even reverence cannot undo the damage of centuries. They peeled back layers of dust, uncovered details hidden beneath grime and lichen. They saw what others had forgotten, the heraldry painted with loving arrogance, the animals carved in still vigilance, the children rendered in stone, who had long turned to bone. It was in this careful uncovering that they noticed the coronet was gone. Once, a small crown, symbolic, ceremonial, but unmistakable, had been fixed near the knees of Henry's effigy, a sign of his status, a mark of honor in death he had not been given in life. And now it was missing. Not misplaced. Missing. Stolen. Perhaps decades earlier. Taken during one of the many quiet desecrations that happen not with swords or fire, but with greed and silence. There was no outrage, no investigation, just a record made. A replica fashioned. A new coronet placed where the old one had vanished. History was patched. Memory was repainted. But beneath the tomb, no one looked. The vault was never opened. Not during the cracking. Not during the sinking. Not during the theft. The great alabaster monument was treated like a surface, like a canvas, like a lie agreed upon by time and tradition. No one dared go deeper. No one wanted to know whether the body it honored still lay below, whether the bones of Henry Howard had made the journey from London after all, whether the head, once separated by a blade, had ever been returned to its place. There is something sacred in not knowing. Something safe. To open the vault would be to confront the questions history prefers to leave unanswered. It would be to disturb a silence that had stretched across 4 centuries. And so, they restored only what could be seen. But the cracks had done more than damage marble. They had reminded everyone that the past cannot be sealed, only buried. The tomb remains today, standing again, straighter than before, polished, cleaned, preserved. But the floor beneath it is no longer trusted. The earth has been disturbed too many times. The weight of history pulls at it from below, demanding attention. And still, no one opens the vault. Perhaps because they are afraid of what they won't find. Because if the coffin is empty, if the traitor was never brought home, if the bones beneath the alabaster are not his, then the tomb becomes something else. A monument not to remembrance, but to erasure. A story rewritten not with truth, but with artistry. And yet, does that matter? For those who come to Framlingham today, for the school children sketching coats of arms and the tourists running fingers across stone lions, the tomb is real. It holds weight. It speaks. It tells a story that Tower Hill never could. A story not of execution, but of endurance. In that sense, the tomb may be more honest than the history books, because whether or not Henry Howard lies beneath it, his memory certainly does. His pride, his poetry, his fall, his silence, all of it carved into stone, surrounded by family, elevated not by kings, but by the passage of time. The cracks have been sealed, the coronet restored. But the question remains, what exactly? Are we preserving the truth or the illusion of peace? There is something cruel in the way history forgets poets. Soldiers are remembered in songs, kings in statues. But poets, true poets, are often left to haunt the edges of what remains, drifting like smoke through corridors their words once filled. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was many things: a nobleman, a soldier, a scandal, a traitor. But before he was any of that, before the heraldry and the axe and the tomb that cracked under time, he was a writer, a son of England's fading chivalry, who carved his thoughts into verse, long before fate carved his name into stone. And it is there in ink, not marble, that the ghost of Henry Howard still lingers. They call him the father of the English sonnet. It sounds impossible, romantic, untrue. And yet the lines remain structured, measured, burning quietly with pride and melancholy. Long before he stood on Tower Hill, Henry Howard stood at the very edge of literary transformation. He took the sonnet form from the Italians and shaped it into something English, something sharp. He wrote not just of courtly love and beauty, but of sorrow, exile, betrayal. He wrote like a man who knew the fall was coming. Perhaps he always did. His poems speak of loyalty and loss, of truth, twisted by power. They speak of the dangers of pride, the cost of nobility, the brittleness of favor. They are, in many ways, warnings written in a hand that would soon be shackled. And though time has buried his verses under the louder voices of later poets, the bones of English poetry lie, in part, within his work. He was the forerunner of Wyatt, the precursor to Shakespeare, the whisper behind centuries of verse. And yet his tomb says none of this. The alabaster figure that rests atop his grave bears armor, not parchment. The lions at his feet roar for lineage, not lyric. His sons kneel in carved submission. His daughters wait, with stone-still grace. But nowhere, not in Latin inscription or heraldic flourish, is the poet honored. The man who once shaped the future of English letters is remembered only for the blood in his veins and the stain of his death. The tomb celebrates the noble. The poetry lies forgotten beneath it, or perhaps nowhere at all. There's a lie in that stone, not a malicious one, not a deliberate deception, but a soft, silent omission that shifts, meaning as gently as dust settles. The lie is not in what the tomb says, but in what it chooses not to say. It is a monument to status, not to soul. It tells you of Henry Howard the Earl, the husband, the father, but it tells you nothing of Henry Howard, the man who once looked at England not with conquest in his heart, but with metaphor on his tongue. And that is where the ghost begins. Not the ghost of a specter that walks the church at night, not a figure in chains, clanking in the crypt, but the ghost of intention, the ghost of a life misremembered, of legacy reduced to stone when it should have been preserved in sound. There is something haunting in the silence of that tomb, not because it hides a secret corpse or because the vault may be empty, but because it never bothered to speak of what mattered most. Henry Howard was executed for treason. Yes, but long before that blade touched his neck, he had already carved his name into the bones of the language. He had already created something that would last longer than kings, longer than churches, longer than his own tomb. The sonnet form that we now take for granted, refined, elevated, eternal, was once the obsession of a young man who dared to shape feeling into form, line by line, even as politics closed around his throat. And perhaps that is why the alabaster feels cold, because it tries to make him into something he never truly was. The man buried there, or honored there, depending on what lies below, was not just a symbol of aristocracy. He was not just a tragic echo of Henry VIII's last wrath. He was a voice, one that warned of ambition, that mourned lost favor, that ached for something beyond the grasp of title, one that now lingers only in pages few ever turn. You can visit his tomb, you can stand beside it and marvel at the craftsmanship, the symmetry, the weight of it. But if you do not know the words he wrote, if you do not feel the soft edge of his sonnets pressing against the silence, then you are only seeing half the truth. Because monuments can lie, and ghosts never forget what was left unsaid. It sits beneath the feet of tourists, now beneath the slow shuffle of footsteps, beneath the muffled awe of stone vaults and stained glass windows. The vault that holds or claims to hold what remains of Henry Howard lies silent, sealed, and strangely untouched. For centuries, no one has dared open it. Not when the tomb cracked. Not when the coronet vanished. Not when restoration breathed life back into alabaster that had faded into ghost-pale white. They worked above, but never below. They fixed the shell, but not the truth. And so the vault remains a question buried in stone. We assume he's there. That's the language preservationists and historians use, assume, not know, not confirm. No record has ever proven beyond doubt that the body moved from London in 1614 was truly his. We know a coffin was exhumed. We know it was carted through muddy roads and frost-bitten towns to Suffolk. We know it arrived. We know a vault was opened and sealed. But we do not know if the man who died on Tower Hill truly lies beneath the church of St. Michael the Archangel. That kind of uncertainty would unravel a lesser legacy. But Henry Howard's legacy is already fractured part bloodline, part poetry, part accusation, part art. And perhaps that's why this doubt clings so tightly to his story. Because even in death, he cannot be fully known. The vault has never been opened, not even during the chaotic restorations of the 19th century, when builders smashed through old stones, broke into crypts, and handled the remains of kings and bastards with hands dusted in chalk. It was during this time that Henry Fitzroy's body, Henry VIII's illegitimate son and Howard's childhood companion, was reportedly seen, still laid in solemn rest beneath the church. But Howard's vault remained closed, untouched, unconfirmed. And then, in the 1970s, when the tomb above began to sag and split under its own weight, there came another chance to open it, to finally know. But again, they stopped short. They patched the surface, repainted the heraldry, replaced the missing coronet. But they did not lift the stone. They did not look beneath. The reasons, they said, were practical. The vault posed no structural risk. There was no mandate, no historical emergency. But deeper than practicality, there was something else. A reluctance, an unspoken fear of what might be found or not found if the tomb was opened. Because what if it's empty? What if the real Henry Howard lies elsewhere, still in London? Still near Tower Hill? Still buried in a quiet corner of All Hallows, or cast into a pit with those whose names didn't survive? What if the grand monument at Framlingham is a memorial, not a grave, a performance of memory, not a preservation of truth? And if so, what then? It wouldn't be the first time history chose beauty over honesty. The Tudors, after all, were masters of myth. They knew that a well-built story, like a well-built tomb, could outlast any scandal, that it could survive cracked stone, lost crowns, even an absent corpse. And perhaps the Howards knew it too. Perhaps the son who ordered the reburial in 1614 knew he was moving not just a body but a narrative. Perhaps he didn't care what lay inside the coffin. Perhaps he only needed it to be seen. A vault beneath a painted tomb is a promise. It says this life mattered. This life was claimed. This name will not disappear. But time forgets promises. And now the vault sits like a sealed mouth, waiting for a question no one will ask, waiting beneath alabaster saints and painted lions, beneath the kneeling children and the silent wife, beneath stone so clean and still that it seems to hum with the weight of omission, waiting beneath the prayers whispered by strangers who do not know they're standing atop uncertainty, waiting while the story unfolds above it like a tapestry stitched too neatly to trust. Maybe Henry Howard is there, whole and quiet, watching. Or maybe he's somewhere else, laughing in the dark at all the effort spent, pretending death can be tidy. But either way, The vault has been forgotten. Not because it is lost, but because remembering it would mean confronting the uneasy truth that memory, like marble, can be shaped into something beautiful and false. And so we leave it alone. We polish the tomb. We point at the effigy. We repeat the tale. We admire the artistry. But we do not open the vault. We do not risk what lies beneath. Because sometimes, what history fears most is a silence that answers back. There is a kind of stillness that only comes at the end of a long story. A stillness that settles not over a battlefield or a courtroom, but over memory itself. It is the quiet after the scaffold has been dismantled, after the crowds have gone home, after the blood has dried and the name has stopped echoing through the marble halls of power. That is where we find Henry Howard now, not in the shouts, not in the records, not even in the poems that once bore his voice, but in the silence that refuses to close around him. A silence that has failed, time and again, to bury him properly, because he was supposed to disappear. That was the point of the scaffold. That was the point of the blade, of the trial, of the verdict signed by a king who could no longer walk, but could still damn a man with a flick of the wrist. It was supposed to be final. His pride, his bloodline, his poetry cut off, reduced to one last breath, one last bow, one final mistake written in heraldry. And yet, he remains, in the tomb that still stands, in the vault that was never opened, in the poetry that scholars forget to teach but cannot erase, in the soft suspicions passed down through generations. Was he really buried there? Was the coronet really stolen? Did they sew the head back on? Did the son know the coffin was empty? And maybe, most strangely, in the way his story lingers, not as a triumph, not as a tragedy, but as a question. What does it mean to be remembered? Is it the stone above your bones? The names carved beside yours? The lions at your feet and the daughters at your head? Is it a tomb so grand that strangers stop to take photographs, never knowing what lies beneath or doesn't? Is it the echo of your words, in a form you helped shape, the meter and rhyme long outliving the voice that spoke them? Or is it something quieter, a pause in someone's step, a shiver in the cold pew of a forgotten church, a single line of verse, half remembered, that slips into the heart of someone centuries too late to know your name but just in time to feel it? Henry Howard has been buried twice, maybe 3 times. Once in London, under suspicion. Once in Suffolk, under stone. And countless times in the margins of history books. Each time, more neatly than the last. But something in his story refuses to settle. It rises through the cracks of his alabaster tomb. It flickers in the missing coronet. It lingers in the vault no one dares open. It hums in the stone lions, whose mouths are silent, but whose eyes have seen too much. This was a man who would not go quietly. Not in life. Not in death. Not even in memory. And so, here we are at the end of a story that doesn't quite end. We can lower our voices, dim the lights, close the book. But somewhere, Henry Howard still walks the cold road from the tower to the scaffold. Somewhere, he still kneels before a crowd that doesn't know whether to cheer or to weep. Somewhere, his words still hang in the air, waiting to be heard by ears that might finally understand him, not as traitor, nor as martyr, but as a man who tried to be many things in a world that only allowed him to be one. And in that, perhaps, there is something worth remembering. Not the title, not the tomb, but the silence he broke and the silence he left behind. So rest now, if you can, but know this, not all traitors vanish. Some stay, some speak, Some refuse to stay buried. Good night.
It is gone.
What do you mean, gone?